AI in Action is brought to you by Alldus International, covering your business's staffing, consulting, and networking needs. Our host brings you the leading minds in AI, sharing their story, their success, and their advice. Focusing on fast-tracking you to the top, AI in Action cuts through the hype to help you kickstart your data science career. To listen to the latest AI in Action podcast, head over to www.alldus.com/podcast or subscribe via iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Podcasts.
You're listening to AI in Action. I'm your host, JP Valentine. Our guest today is Michael Martin. Michael is the CEO of RapidSOS. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, JP. Great to be here.
No, it's our pleasure. So, Michael, let's start with yourself. Can you give us a background of your journey in technology, where you first got started, what got you interested? Talk us through some of the roles that you've held along the way, leading up to just before your CEO role at Rapid.
Yeah, well, I grew up in a rural farming community in southern Indiana, and it was, I think, a pretty amazing place to grow up as a child. Now, it wasn't particularly tech forward, although today I think the tractors have come a long way and with the autonomous technology. But it was a place where I learned kind of the importance and value of community. And that would be, I think, a core pillar ultimately for the work that we do at RapidSOS today, which we'll probably talk a little bit later. So after, growing up on a farm, I was always kind of a total nerd, I would say. So, my brother was a standout high school athlete. I was the guy who would, at a school dance in middle school, play chess in the corner. So wasn't always the coolest kid, but after growing up there, went away to college at a small school in Minnesota, and then ultimately came to New York City to work in venture capital, where I think I'd always been very fascinated with how we can harness technology to try to solve big challenges. And so initially was focused on kind of energy innovation, but that was also where I had my first experience with what it's like to call 911 in an emergency. And the realization that our U.S. 911 infrastructure really dates back to the 1960s and all the challenges that presents for the heroic first responders across the United States and for the roughly 250 million Americans that need help every single year.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. And I think you do yourself a disservice by not highlighting the fact that as a CEO of a health tech company, you've certainly become somewhat cooler now than maybe in your earlier years. So look, you gave us a little bit of insight into the origins behind RapidSOS. So could you take us through that thought process, where the idea first came about, the circumstances that led you to decide to launch your own organization, and then most importantly, what's the mission of the organization? What are you guys doing?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, so I was in New York City working in venture capital and was just walking home late one night to my apartment, and it was probably 2 a.m. and I had basically my welcome to New York City mugging experience. And it was the first time I'd ever really thought about, JP, about like calling 911. And the first time I realized, like, in the middle of an emergency, whatever that emergency is, whether it's an assault, a kidnapping, a heart attack, like, it is difficult to somehow get out your phone, dial a number, and have this coherent conversation, right? I mean, it was in that moment that I started thinking more about this. Now, Uber had just come out, and originally I thought this was a user experience question, right? Like, I could press a button and get a car. Why couldn't I press a button and get police, fire, EMS? And so from that experience, started kind of trying to dig in more on this. So I had a rule that I needed to talk to at least 10 911 agencies per week. And very quickly it became apparent that this wasn't really a UX question. This was a national infrastructure challenge with, over 70,000 first responders across the United States and obviously many more globally that were managing 250 million emergencies a year in the United States, over 2 billion globally, all through this 1960s analog voice-based system. And it is remarkable how well it works in light of that challenge. But really, it was so apparent, like, there's so much need for technology here to partner with those first responders to help everyone in emergencies.
Yeah, I think you touch on a very important point, which is often the foundation of any great disruption idea. It's identifying a problem and looking at how can technology improve the service. And I think you've certainly hit the nail on the head with RapidSOS. So that was the origins behind it. Can you give us some insight into how you guys are utilizing data and technology to improve this service, which hasn't changed all that much in the better half of 60 years?
Yeah, and I think that started with, again, like each of those conversations. So after that experience, and talking to all these 911 agencies, my father actually had a separate incident where he fell off the roof of our childhood home in the middle of a snowstorm. He was home alone by himself, and didn't have an ability to reach 911 until several hours later. My mom came home and was able to try to alarm him while frantically calling 911. So I think those experiences really crystallized in me like the importance of this particular of these moments, right? The 250 million moments a year that we face in emergencies. And I think then it was all these conversations with first responders and 911 agencies, again, trying to do at least 10 a week, and then going ultimately to grad school, where I met my co-founder and we built a growing team out of MIT and Harvard, where we really started actually spending even more time with first responders and public safety to understand the magnitude of that challenge. So during the summer of grad school, I actually borrowed my dad's Prius and drove over 3,000 miles meeting with 911 agencies along the way. And, I will never forget, JP, like one of the first calls I listened in on was a mom who called after her son had committed suicide. And you can imagine she was hysterical, screaming for help on the phone. I actually took off my headset and I walked outside. I couldn't last more than 15 seconds, and the 911 telecommunicator had to stay on the phone for the next 9 minutes, figure out the woman's address, and then stayed with her, until the ambulance arrived. And then she did that for the rest of her 12-hour shift for $38,000 a year, right? So it was in that moment where I realized like this wasn't just a tech or data challenge. Like this was, how do we partner with these heroes on the first lines to drive and help make their jobs a little bit easier? How do we get the right data to the right place at the right time? So you can imagine in this case, a live video feed of that lifeless child from some sort of camera system or something would not have been helpful, right? Versus like we were talking to some of the first responders in a few of the more recent active shooter tragedies. And again, we heard about how SWAT teams were going in totally blind, JP. Like they literally, were listening to gunshots as they were rounding corners and trying to figure out where the shooter was, right? And in those scenarios, right, our schools have camera systems. Every student has a smartphone, right, with cameras. So in that scenario, right, getting that data into the hands of the SWAT team as they're en route could totally transform outcomes. So we ultimately would spend about 8 years building out a data framework for emergency response. It was all about the right data, the right place at the right time. Studied 12.5 million 911 calls when we were in grad school. Actually would listen in on the calls, in many cases time every single question that 911 telecommunicator would ask. And then we would look like, if they're asking like, what is your age? Are you breathing right now? Like, do you have pre-existing health conditions? How could we answer those questions with data so that we could actually potentially skip the question, and move faster to get to response? And so that kind of was the underpinnings of the technology and how we thought about the data. And so it was not where I started from was data is going to solve every problem here. And where I got to was just this really humbling moment sitting with 911 telecommunicators and learning just how extraordinarily difficult that job is. And that we were going to have to be really thoughtful about how we integrated data and technology to really help them do their jobs and not to cause, additional challenges for them.
Yeah, I think it's sobering to hear about the reality of that role and feeling those calls all the time. But then when you think about the mechanics of how many questions are asked that could easily be answered with just data that's readily available by bringing together various data sources. Staying on that point, could you give us some insight into some of the exciting projects that you're currently working on?
Yeah. And I think maybe almost if I can just like crystallize that challenge slightly further, I think since I'm a data nerd, I'll actually kind of share some of the stats around this. So on a typical 911 call, the entire data payload is limited to 512 bytes of data. Now, we don't think about bytes of data anymore, right? Like, we're doing this during COVID, so we're both remote, so we're streaming this interview. It's probably 100 megabytes per second for both of us, right? That's like 100 million bytes of data every single second. But when your life is on the line, we go back to this 1960s analog-based system. And just to put that in perspective, those 512 bytes of data are actually less data than was transmitted in the very first transatlantic telegram between the Queen of England and President Buchanan in 1858, right? So it's just extraordinary the work that 911 and first responders do to save 200 plus million lives a year with basically no data coming through, right? I almost think of it, it's almost like I had a customer that kind of gave me this idea. It's like an hourglass, basically, right? Like, around us is all this information, right? Like, data from 20 billion connected devices today. Like, I'm wearing an Apple Watch. I have a smartphone. This apartment I'm in has a smoke alarm system. The building's connected, right? All this data. And then the 911 agency, they have increasingly sophisticated systems. But between the two is this drip, drip, drip of an analog phone line. And so that was the challenge that we had to really focus on figuring out how we could solve. And so one of the things we learned when we were out visiting with all these 911 agencies during grad school is that, every municipality is a little bit different. Every system's a little bit different. You have to think about kind of that local community and experience. So the type of emergencies that, a 911 agency in the mountains of Colorado deals with are going to be very different from the types of emergencies that, say, the New York City 911 center manages. So we ultimately figured out that we were going to have to embed this data flow inside the existing software systems that run at 911 agencies. And so that also would take a number of years to partner with over 100 different software vendors, ultimately integrating into around 10,000 different public safety software systems. And again, like, you're going to want that data at the right place at the right time. So maybe location is very important in the first software system, like the phone system, basically. But then, like, medical data is pretty important, maybe out into the ambulance, as an example, right? So thinking about that end-to-end data stream. And so just to kind of wrap on your original question, JP, like, what we're thinking about now, today the RapidSOS emergency response data platform powers about 4,800 911 agencies, covering approximately 92% of the US population. We've just started to launch in several international markets as well. So we're powering over 90% of data across the US 911 system today. And we're really working on how do we bring more and more content and information into all that infrastructure that we've been building over the last 8 years with $100 million of research and development at this point. So a few examples of that: after COVID hit, we partnered with Apple to figure out how we could get medical ID and health information that users opt into sharing into the hands of 911 in an emergency. So things like pre-existing health conditions, allergies, medications, et cetera. We've worked with the Red Cross on some similar sort of work. We just signed SiriusXM, which is the largest connected vehicle safety platform in the United States. So now for 10 million vehicles, if they're in a crash, again, no need to kind of, in the middle of that crash, figure out how to verbally articulate and call 911, the data instantly on the screen of police, fire, EMS. So much faster, more effective response. So that's what we're thinking about today is looping in that whole ecosystem. To go back to this analogy, right? All this data that exists around us, getting that directly into the hands of 911 when it matters most.
It's incredible. And I can't help but think the greatest business ideas often seem so obvious after somebody has implemented them. It's amazing to see that before Rapid, we were still dealing with such an old analog system. But I'm relieved to hear that somebody like you is out there and is part of this digital transformation, because Lord knows we'll all benefit from it. You talked about the data. You talked about you're a data guy at heart yourself. So I want to get a look behind the scenes, because how data science and analytics is driving the value and how you've created value for the product and service with the use of data science.
We aren't a data company in the sense that we actually discard our data after it goes through our pipes into 911. We briefly retain it in case 911 needs it for an ongoing incident. But where we are absolutely a data company is that we transformed a system that was previously analog voice-based into a rich data framework. So that's where we had to really study the human data interface. So, and really in one of the most challenging environments that you can imagine, JP, right? Like, it's okay if on a regular website, like if they don't have the user experience totally nailed, right? It's okay if like you click a link and it doesn't work. But in heart attack, which is the leading cause of death in the United States, every minute that you get to that victim faster reduces mortality rates by approximately 7%. So if we mess up the user interface, right, and as a result, that ambulance arrives 1 minute later, you're talking about over 2,000 additional fatalities a year. So we had to spend a tremendous amount of energy on thinking about how do you operationalize that content and make it useful across the 911 flow. So we do have a large product team, a large design team. We work very closely with the public safety community. We have approximately 5,000 first responders that served as beta testers or early users of the platform. Today, we work very closely with 150 or so top thought leading 911 agencies on new product development, testing, integration, et cetera. Our team spends approximately 25,000 hours a year out in the field with 911 agencies and first responders, trying to think about, how do we kind of continue that evolution of data into 911 and first responder systems. And then we do have a small data science team that also helps us think about, the right data at the right place at the right time.
Amazing, and thank you for that. So you touched on data flow and data ingestion, and building a data science team is more than just your data scientists. It's the ETL pipeline engineers, it's the analysts, it's the visualization side, and it's the back end and front end. So can you talk to us from your perspective of what the ideal data team looks like, and how you've gone about building it and how you effectively manage it?
Yeah, I think that there are, kind of a couple different pillars to that ideal data science team. And I think that, on a foundation, if you will, I'm going to build my data science house here. The foundational leverage is, taking on a meaningful challenge that's really worth solving, I think. I hope we can continue to advance technology to solve big problems in the world. And then I think you have a pillar, on the left side here, perhaps, that's really about, partnering with a user community that is involved in that challenge. So for us, that meant, as I mentioned, over 100,000 hours since inception out in the field with 911 and first responders to understand, like, how can we bring the power of data to solve their challenge, and how can we implement that in an impactful way? I think the middle core pillar there is obviously team, right? So you need a team that brings that expertise to take on and make all that happen. And I think, for us, that team has multiple subcomponents. So, it's a product team that's working on the interfaces into these various systems, working on the usability, the user experience, et cetera. It's a core data science team that understands how do we, what is our approach to data where we can maximize the impact we can have with it. And then obviously it's an engineering organization that can actually do all the nuts and bolts to make all that plumbing work. And in our case, in a intense mission critical environment sort of way where uptime, reliability, et cetera, really matters. And then the third pillar here, I think, is a commitment to learning, meaning that, the power of data is that we're always getting new insights from it, more and more information, right? The data in our world is growing exponentially right now. And so we have to, across this entire foundation of our data organization, think about how can we learn every step of the way here to continue to drive towards that mission, which in the case of RapidSOS is protecting communities, families, partnering with 911 to make our world safer.
I think that's some incredible advice. I think a lot of people could really benefit and learn from how you've laid it out there based on building the core foundational pillars. So look, you founded Rapid in December of 2012, so we're fast approaching the 8-year mark now. It would be great to understand. Look, you've talked about some of the milestones, and it's been very successful. But it'd be good to understand some of the challenges that you've faced along the way, particularly early on in your career.
Yeah, there's plenty of challenges. One of the biggest challenges was me. So, I had never, I obviously never been a CEO before. I also never really led anyone, right? I'd worked in venture capital, which means I'd had this great opportunity and privilege to work with really innovative CEOs. But if you think about who worked with me in that job, right? Maybe I had an intern or an analyst reporting to me. So one of the things when it occurred to me, the magnitude of the challenge and the need here from all those conversations with 911 telecommunicators is that was a core driver for me to go to business school and really focus on, how do we think about building and leading and empowering an organization to try to take on a big challenge. The next challenge for me was I have no real skills. Even though I love data, I am not an engineer, so when I was in grad school in Cambridge, I ended up going to every single event at MIT that I possibly could, and ultimately that's where I met Nick Horlick, my co-founder, who was doing his PhD in nuclear engineering there at the time, and had some similar experiences with this challenge. And so really it was, Nick that became our foundation and the brains behind how do we build and operationalize all this technology and data and build an organization around that. So I think, for me personally, there were plenty of challenges, and there continue to be, and how do I continue to learn and grow and expand. RapidSOS today is over 150 people across the United States and in a few international countries. So continuing that transition, right, from founder to ultimately partnering and enabling a team and organization. I think the next big challenge that we had to think through a lot was, learning about the public safety industry. I think approached it with a degree of arrogance that was totally we shouldn't have had. And I think one of the things we learned over those first 4 years of where we were just trying to get out and talk to every single 911 official that we could, was that all of our preconceived notions, right? The data was going to magically solve every problem here. Just throw it over the wall, right? We're like these, right, 26-year-old kids. We're going to tell you how technology can solve all your problems, right? Was totally off base, right? And what we learned was that we were going to need to partner with this industry. And what was amazing about that, JP, was how the industry rallied around that. So as I mentioned, we'd ultimately work with over 5,000 first responders to build the core technology. The first iteration, we were actually initially a mobile app for the consumer that you could basically, press a button and get a response. And what we learned from the 911 community is that wasn't nearly good enough, right? We were never going to solve this problem which exists for everyone in the United States and ultimately everyone globally unless we could work with major technology companies like Apple and Google to do that. So I think, learning how to work with public safety and to be partners with them, their software vendors, that whole community was absolutely critical for us. And then I think the last piece was thinking about how we could also enable and build, this platform. So we had this kind of big, if you will, almost chicken and the egg problem, right? So in order for me to kind of push data into all these 911 agencies, I've got to have data to feed in there, or else if you're a 911 agency, it's not worth doing the work to integrate our technology, right? And if you're a big data source for us, if you're someone that's trying to save the lives of your users, like say an Apple was, or someone like that, who's one of our larger customers, for them, they don't want to share any content with us unless I can deliver it for every one of their 911 calls. So how did you solve that chicken and the egg thing was a major challenge for us. And fortunately, once again, it was this community approach, getting back to your original question about kind of growing up in rural Indiana and learning the power of community. I think, we ultimately had to apply a community-centric approach to solving this challenge, meaning that we were never going to get there if it was just us and 911, or if it was just us and big tech. It was going to take all the stakeholders here, 911 and first responders, telling us what they needed, partnering with them on it, RapidSOS working on the back-end tech infrastructure, 911 software vendors integrating our stuff and training and implementing that at all these agencies, over 5,000 agencies in the United States. And then finally, obviously, big tech companies like Apple, Google, Uber, et cetera, that we're partnered with, which help drive all this critical life-saving information across. So it's been a humbling journey, JP, with plenty of mistakes. I'm sure there will be plenty more along the way here, but if nothing else, I think the biggest takeaway was just the power of community to overcome, big challenges. All the mistakes that I would make, the power of the community overcame those.
I appreciate you sharing that and being so candid with us, because I think everyone knows that it's not an easy path to walk when you form a startup. But throughout the pitfalls and challenges, you've had an upward trajectory, which is great. My final question for you: what do you love most about what you do? Talk to us about what you enjoy, because clearly you're passionate about what you do. You have a mission which everyone could get behind. But it'd be good to understand that, what do you enjoy most about what you're doing right now?
I think the most powerful thing that I love most about this is the human impact side of it. So it is extraordinarily rewarding to work every day with the heroic first responders on the front lines. As we're recording this, there's fairly unprecedented wildfires in California right now, as an example. And over the weekend, we saw 911 traffic across California spike, and some regions up over 600%, right? And what a privilege to try to help all those folks on the first lines that are saving lives every single day is part of this. So partnering at the human level with the public safety community to try to solve this challenge, and then the impact that they've been able to have with some of our technology. So I keep with me, JP, in my backpack on my bedside is a book, and this is the latest one. So this is from March 2020, and every page here is a life, that 911 was able to save, where our technology played a small part in helping make that occur. And so stories of children that were born, people that were had heart attacks, people that had domestic violence cases, just some really powerful and compelling stories. And for me, it's just the most rewarding thing every day to be able to work with the public safety community to try to solve this challenge and hopefully to help, almost 1 million people a day that are calling 911.
Michael, I appreciate you coming on and telling us your story and talking to us about RapidSOS. It's incredible, and we're very thankful for what you're doing and the impact that it's making. And we wish you all the best with your continued journey, because this is something that will impact us all. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you, JP. Great being on. Appreciate the time.
AI in Action is brought to you by Alldus International, covering your business's staffing, consulting, and networking needs. Alldus offer an exec search program. Alldus can help you discover how data science and AI can transform your company. With our unrivaled network of C-suite executives and senior AI professionals, we offer retained search services across the US and Europe. For more information, contact mark@alldus.com. Get the Alldus advantage. Become a member of the Alldus community and enjoy some of the following: AI meetups. Once a month, our community gathers to listen to some of the leading experts in the world of data science and AI. Our speakers come from all over the world, including Dublin, Boston, and Frankfurt. We also have our AI mentors. Our experts will provide mentoring to Alldus members. And don't forget our AI in Action podcast. Each week we have guests from all over the world talking us through their education, career, and more. Become an Alldus member and get the Alldus advantage. For more information and to sign up for our newsletter, log on to www.alldus.com. That's www.alldus.com. Alldus International, empowering through AI.